Good morning to all. I extend a warm welcome to all on the occasion of second Professor Radhakrishna Memorial Lecture. I extend a warm welcome to our chairman, Professor Nachane, to Professor Sudipto Mundle, who is the speaker of today's lecture, and our board members, Professor Mahinda Reddy, and faculty from others, Professor D. Narasimha Reddy and other institutions, faculty of CESS, family members of Professor Radhakrishna, and students, scholars, and other institutions. First, let us pay a floral tribute to Professor Radhakrishna, and then we'll proceed with the program. I request Chairman to lead paying floral tribute. I also welcome Professor Manoj Panda and Professor Galab and others who have joined online. I now invite our chairman, Professor Nachane, onto the dais. Professor Nachane, yes, sir, is Professor Emeritus and former Director Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research and former Chancellor, University of Manipur, and distinguished scholar extensively researched in macroeconomics, monetary policy, its transmission into real economy, inflation estimation, exchange rate regimes, business cycles, international trade and balance of payments, and on economic reforms. He is very much conversant in the history of economics, economic history, literature and policy, philosophy, discussions, and we have a very engaging time with him discussing on various issues, which is a very learning experience. Thank you, sir. I now invite Professor Sudipto Mundle, Chairman, Center for Development Studies, who is today's speaker. He is Professor Emeritus at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, Distinguished Fellow at NCER, and Visiting Faculty at the School of Public Policy. He was member of 14th Finance Commission and member of National Statistical Commission, and also was its chairman for some time. He spent much of his career at the Asian Development Bank. He was an economic advisor in India's Ministry of Finance from 86 to 89, and his research includes contributions to development economics, fiscal and monetary policy, macroeconomic modeling, and governance. He also worked on state finances, longitudinal village studies, and employment policy. He is a columnist. We all know that he writes frequently. He's a columnist in the financial newspaper Mint. I requested Sir last year and he has agreed to give this lecture. Thank you for accepting our invitation and being with us today, sir. We know that Professor Radhakrishna Memorial Lecture, this is the second lecture that is being held. The first lecture was held during the IRC conference, which CESS has hosted in 2023. And at that time, Professor Deepak Nair has given this first lecture. I know that Professor Radhakrishna was both director and chairman at CESS, and for the benefit of the students here, I would give a brief talk briefly about Professor Radhakrishna. Professor Radhakrishna did his master's degree in economics and statistics from Andhra University and obtained PhD in Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. He was director, Center for Economic Studies, 85 to 94, and also its chairman from 2013 till the time he passed away in 2022. He became professor at a young age of 31 years at Sardar Patel Institute of Social and Economic Research, and worked with Professor Y.K. Alag, who was also our board member some time back. He was visiting fellow University College of Wales in UK, and after which he became professor in Department of Economics in Hyderabad Central University. But he was invited to take up as director of CESS by BPR Vithal in 1985. Thus, he continued till 9 years. And he took up this task initially on an honorary basis. Subsequently, he gave up his job at Hyderabad Central University to become full-time director. And then he was asked to take up as member secretary ICSSR. He left CESS. He was an institution builder and contributed to the growth and stability of our institution. Subsequently, he assumed as member secretary and then later vice chancellor, Andhra University, and director or vice chancellor of Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, and then took over as chairman in 2013. The regular PhD program, which was started at CESS in 2016, he took great interest in that and also helped us in shaping the program. He served as an expert in numerous international organizations, UNESCO, UNICEF, UNDP, and he was also a consultant to several international bodies like ADB, UNDP, and FAO. Professor Radhakrishna held several important positions. The latest was he was chairman of a Commission on Inclusive and Sustainable Agricultural Development of Andhra Pradesh. That was the last commission that he chaired in 2015, during 2015-16. He was earlier chairman of National Statistical Commission. I think Professor Sudipto Mundle was also member of that commission. And he chaired a number of official committees of national significance. Of these, expert group on farmers' indebtedness, and then the committee on credit-related issues under SGSY are well known, which also contributed to policy making. Following the recommendations made in this made in the committee on credit-related issues under SGSY, Government of India established National Rural Livelihood Mission in 2011. He was also a member of the 3 important Planning Commission expert groups related to poverty. That's Task Force on Projections of Minimum Needs and Effective Consumption Demand, and expert group on estimation of proportion and number of poor, and expert group to review the methodologies on estimation of the poor. He was also chairman of UGC committees to review universities and ICSSR review committee to review its research institutes in Northwest India. Professor Radhakrishna was associated with academic and research institutions in the capacity of chairman or board member of MIDS and Madras School of Economics and Center for Development Alternatives, and also Institute of Development Studies, Andhra Pradesh. He was president of professional bodies like Indian Society of Agriculture Marketing, and he was president-elect of Indian Society of Agriculture Economics, Indian Econometric Society, Indian Society of Labor Economics, and he was also Association of Asian Social Science Research Councils. He was also president of that. He served on editorial boards, number of editorial boards of several peer-reviewed academic journals. Professor Radhakrishna is an eminent development economist, well-known academician, and highly respected teacher. He has successfully supervised 25 doctoral students towards submission of their thesis. He published a large number of books and more than 100 original research papers. And his well cited publications include India's public distribution system, a national and international perspective, empowering rural labor, India Development Report, Handbook of Poverty in India, and policy perspective. In recognition of his significant academic contributions, he was awarded VKRV Prize in Economics in 1985 and Telugu Atma Gaurava Puraskaram for his eminence in social sciences by Government of Andhra Pradesh then in 1998. His work is also the partial demand analysis. He worked on partial demand analysis. He has been involved in advising and assisting several policy-making bodies, and his compendium of books published by Academic Foundation, that was the last, in 2017, are on the themes of Indian economy, agriculture, food security, and nutrition, growth, poverty, and well-being. CESS will remember him for his contributions and follow the legacy. Thank you, sir. I now invite the chairman to give his initial remarks.
Dr. Sudipto Mundle, Dr. Revati, Dr. Mahindra Reddy, other governing board members, members of Dr. Radhakrishna family, are they present? Yeah, they are present online. And then Dr. Ramano Reddy, former editor of BPW, and Dr. D. N. Reddy from Central University, Hyderabad. Colleagues, faculty members, staff members, and students and friends. I'm very happy that Dr. Sudipto Mundle is with us today to deliver the second Radhakrishna Memorial Lecture. And he's a eminent person, and full details of his achievements have been enumerated, and she is also the president of the Indian Economic Society. Of course, all of us look forward to his lecture on this unemployment issue. But I will add a few words about Dr. Radhakrishna, okay, to whatever Dr. Revati has said. You see, I first met Dr. Radhakrishna way back in 1970s. Okay. In those days, Professor P. N. Mathur was the director of the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. And they were working on what was then considered a very new and novel idea, that was input-output analysis and social accounting matrices, okay, which are usually attributed, okay, to Vasily Yotti, okay, and which is somewhat related to the material balances method which was followed in the Soviet Union. Now, at that time, we used to have annually this seminar, conference on the input-output economics. Dr. Radhakrishnan in 1970 or so was a young person, and he presented a very innovative idea, namely applying input-output analysis to the oilseed sector, okay, which was a major, export generating sector in those days. And this was considered as a methodological innovation, and most of us who had some acquaintance with input-output analysis were very much impressed by his presentation. Later on, we followed the theme further. See, input-output analysis requires a tremendous amount of data collection. Okay? And it requires a tremendous amount of compromises to be made. Okay, with and therefore it was a pleasure to see how much how much effort he put into making these input-output coefficients very precise. He tried to integrate the external sector into the input-output framework. Later on, he and some of his colleagues tried to build regional dimensional models, okay, input-output models for certain states, okay. This itself is also a formidable task. Okay? And I think this set the pace for later research on social accounting matrices and financial flows and so on. Now all these have somehow all this work has somehow fallen into disuse, okay, and I believe wrongly so, okay. After the planning commission was abolished, okay, because I still feel that intersectoral balances cannot be neglected, and intersectoral balances are an extremely important component of the national macroeconomy, and that even in a liberalized environment, some kind of government planning is necessary. Okay, even without violating the spirit of the liberal economy, the government can play a useful role. And in some sense, okay, a planning commission, some kind of a planning commission, okay, uh, is absolutely necessary. We have the Niti Aayog, okay, which is doing good work, okay, and but I still feel that another organization which is closer in spirit to the planning commission is needed, but I will not talk about that. Reverting to Dr. Radhakrishna's other areas of work, you see, he later on did a lot of work on poverty, was involved in the Lakdawala committee and several other committees on poverty measurement and so on. Okay, he also did a lot of work on unemployment, employment issues, as I said, poverty, food sector, agriculture, and so on. And you see, so apart from his own work, later on when I came to know him even more closely after he came to Bombay as director of IGIDR, okay? And of ninth or 10th plan, okay, the technical appendix, social accounting metrics, and so on, and the general equilibrium modeling. I think the general equilibrium modeling, the precursor of the general equilibrium modeling was the input-output analysis and social accounting matrices, to which Dr. Radhakrishnan and others have contributed such a great deal. So, this computational general equilibrium model for, I think, the ninth plan, but I'm not sure about this, I'm not checked. The ninth or 10th plan was done at IGIDR by Dr. Ganesh Kumar and Dr. Manoj Panda, okay, under the overall guidance of Professor Radhakrishnan. So this was about his academic work. I also experienced him as an administrator. And I can say that, he was a very good administrator. I learned a lot of things from him. He had a tremendous judgment. Okay? He could understand an issue immediately. He knew who was who, and he could form judgments very accurately. Okay? He was not afraid to take firm and bold decisions when the need arose. Okay? But he could be very sympathetic and compassionate when he felt there was a genuine need for this. On the personal level, he was a very, very good friend. Myself and my wife used to often visit him. We were faculty members at IGIDR. I was faculty member at IGIDR. And Dr. Radhakrishnan and Mrs. Radhakrishnan frequently invited us to their house, okay? And they were gracious hosts. And before concluding, I must also place on record the charming graciousness of Mrs. Radhakrishna, okay? You see, everyone at the IGIDR, okay, was particularly fond of her, and the class 4 staff, okay, used to affectionately call her Rani Bai, okay, call her Rani Bai. Okay, so she was, I'm very sorry that she had to suffer so much, okay, and we are very, very sorry to hear about her illness and her later demise, okay. Dr. Radhakrishna died a bit prematurely. He could have done much more, okay, but then these things are not in our hand. But I'm very happy that these lectures are being organized at CESS, and that his memory is being perpetuated and preserved. I once again welcome Dr. Sudipto Mundle, okay, and I thank him on behalf of all of us, okay, and eagerly look forward to this lecture. Thank you.
A very good morning to all of you, and thank you for being here. Let me begin by thanking the chairman, Professor Nachane, and the director, Professor Revati, for inviting me to give the second Radhakrishna Memorial Lecture today. I really consider it a great honor to be here for this occasion. And he was a personal friend, as I will mention, so it really is a way of my paying homage to him. Professor Radhakrishna was one of India's leading econometricians, an eminent scholar, an experienced administrator in higher education, and a seasoned high-level policy advisor. This is what you have also heard being detailed by both Professor Nachane and Professor Revati. But above all, he was a kind and warm human being, which was also mentioned, which endeared him to one and all. I first met him in the early 1980s and would subsequently meet at conferences and meetings from time to time. But I got to know him well when he invited me to join the National Statistical Commission, which he chaired from 2009 to 2012. We worked very closely together, and I was impressed by his leadership style. Though always gentle in his dealing with colleagues and subordinates alike, he was thoroughly professional and firm in his decisions, something that again Professor Nachane mentioned. Among the many things we accomplished together, I will only mention the draft bill on National Statistical Commission. Had this bill become an act, India would have had a completely autonomous and very powerful statistical commission comparable to those in the UK, USA, Canada, and so on. Unfortunately, that draft bill never even reached Parliament for consideration by our legislators. Why that was is another story that I will not go into here. In an illustrious career spanning half a century, Professor Radhakrishna had many distinguished academic appointments, all of which were detailed earlier. However, throughout his career, he remained firmly rooted in Andhra Pradesh, a son of the soil. It was this groundedness, I believe, which made him very sensitive to the deprivation and struggles of the disadvantaged. A great deal of his academic research and policy work related to the measurement of poverty and nutrition, problems of rural indebtedness, and access to credit for the rural poor. My lecture today on an employment-centered perspective of development is a tribute to him and that dominant theme of his career. In part 2 of this lecture, I pose the question, growth of what? To ask whether GDP growth is indeed the best way to assess the performance of an economy. After discussing alternatives to this commodity fetishism of GDP growth, such as the Human Development Index, I finally propose a combination of indicators led by employment growth. The importance of choosing an appropriate indicator of a country's economic performance becomes clear when in part 3 I turn to what I have called the paradox of Indian growth, a sustained period of high growth but combined with high growth of unemployment. I also discuss what accounts for this paradox, particularly the role of rising capital intensity and creative destruction. I refer to then to two blind spots, underemployment and temporary migrant employment, which makes our employment statistics quite fragile. In part 4, I take a step back to review the foundational framework of modern development theory and how that framework has been extended or modified to accommodate observed empirical patterns. This discussion provides the backdrop for my review of the changing structure of the Indian economy in part 5, in particular, the inverse relationship between the share of major sectors in GDP and in employment. This points to a conflict between the policy goals of maximizing GDP growth and maximizing employment growth. I will suggest a possible sequencing of goal prioritization to resolve this conflict. In part 6, I will discuss the introduction of university technical colleges in secondary education and reform of higher education to develop a highly skilled Indian workforce, which is a necessary condition to ensure that India remains globally competitive and prosperous in the 21st century. Despite all these developments in the non-agricultural sector, agriculture will remain a major employment sector for decades. In part 7, I will discuss what needs to be done to radically improve the very low productivity in agriculture in an ecologically sustainable way. In part 8, I will draw some conclusions. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is the standard measure of the size of an economy. When we talk about the growth rate of an economy, we routinely refer to the rate of growth of GDP. However, the generalized acceptance of GDP as the standard measure of the size of an economy is less than 100 years old. It is also beset by many conceptual problems. While discussing the vast literature that led to the adoption of this concept, Simon Kuznets, one of the pioneers who developed the concept of GDP, also pointed to the whole range of problems associated with it. He wrote later in his classic work on the epoch of modern economic growth, and I quote, "In distinguishing the economic and other aspects of social life, one must consider questions of scope or of inclusion and exclusion. In drawing the line between costs of intermediate products and final output, one encounters questions of grossness and netness. And in reducing the diverse economic activities and resulting products to a common denominator, one must consider questions of valuation and weighting." He then went on to say, all these problems are accentuated when product is used to gauge economic growth, because such growth is necessarily accompanied by many institutional and structural changes, which shift the line between the economic and non-economic, modify the cost-output relations, and change, often drastically, the relations of prices, the only feasible basis of valuations. End of quote. In other words, GDP is, after all, a synthetically constructed index number, something we often forget, and therefore beset with all the well-known problems of such index numbers, what to include or exclude, gross and net computations, and the choice of appropriate weights for aggregation in a long time series. Such limitations notwithstanding, there was a wide consensus among Kuznets and his peers that the concept of GDP was the best available concept to measure the size of an economy and track its growth over time. It also provided a basis to compare the economic size of different countries, though such comparisons become more fragile when extended beyond the advanced capitalist countries to economies of less developed or non-market economies, as Kuznets had also noted. These reservations about the concept of GDP, already noted by the pioneers, gathered momentum as there was growing discomfort with the commodity fetishism which I mentioned, that is measuring the size of the economy through the lens of the producers rather than the lens of consumers. It was felt that exclusive attention to GDP growth was diverting attention away from how an economy was performing or not performing, especially in a developing economy, in meeting the basic human needs of the population. Not surprisingly, this critique was formally endorsed at the International Labour Organization, a multilateral platform which gives voice also to workers. The goal of eliminating poverty, providing for all the minimum level of consumption of basic goods, that is food, water, clothing, and shelter, necessary for long-term physical well-being, was endorsed as the principal goal of development by governments and organizations of both workers and employers from all over the world at the World Employment Conference organized by the ILO in Geneva in 1976. This new approach culminated in the landmark World Summit on Social Development in Copenhagen, which firmly put people rather than products at the center of development, emphasized commitments to eradicating poverty, promoting full and productive employment, and fostering social integration. At the analytical level, the critique persisted. Though seen as an improvement compared to GDP, it was felt that the basic needs approach was too narrowly focused on consumption of material goods alone. Amartya Sen, in particular, proposed a much broader concept of development as substantive freedoms or functional capabilities human beings must possess to live fulfilling lives, such as the ability to live to an old age, engage in economic transactions, or participate in political activities. Subsequently, Sen and his associates promoted the capabilities approach in debates concerning human development, eventually leading to the creation of the United Nations Human Development Index, or HDI, which combines capabilities in income, health, and education. It has been adopted globally by individual countries and multilateral agencies as an alternative measure of economic performance. We thus have two alternate measures of development performance, the narrow GDP measure and the broader HDI. Though a broader concept than HDI, broader concept than GDP, HDI is also an aggregate index like the GDP and subject to similar conceptual challenges, questions of what to include and what to exclude in the aggregation, counting of gross versus net outcomes, the inevitable arbitrariness or volatility of weights used in the aggregation, and so on. Recognizing these limitations of aggregative indices combining multiple variables, Sen suggested in a paper published in 1998 that life expectancy or mortality could serve well as a single variable measure of economic performance. This was well after the HDI had been launched in 1990 by the UNDP with his leading contribution. In other words, Amartya Sen, though he has led the creation of the HDI, has never been very comfortable with this business of aggregating a number of things into one scale or value, and always looked for a more direct single variable measure of economic performance. As an alternative to these indices, which aggregate multiple variables, I would like to propose employment growth as the single variable measure of performance in the present Indian context. The Copenhagen Declaration had, in fact, emphasized the commitment to full and productive employment, along with eradicating poverty and fostering social integration. But subsequent global and national action programs have focused more on poverty eradication than employment. to actually, in fact, a development strategy focusing on productive employment growth is the most effective means of ensuring both GDP growth as well as poverty eradication. While claiming that GDP growth is the most appropriate measure of economic performance, especially in the advanced countries, Kuznets had pointed out that a measure of economic performance had to be context-specific, based on prevailing practices and wide consensus among the ends and means of economic activity. In the present Indian context, I would argue that employment growth is the most effective measure of our economic performance. The most serious economic challenge facing India today, in my view, is the huge gap between the rate of growth of output or GDP and the rate of growth of employment. Unemployment, especially youth unemployment, has reached crisis proportions. An acceleration of the rate of growth of employment would not only further accelerate the growth rate of GDP, but would also accelerate the pace of poverty elimination. In addition to the substantive reasons, use of employment growth as the principal indicator of economic performance has several technical advantages. As a single variable, not a composite index, it raises no questions about what to include or exclude in its computation. There is also no issue about netting or choosing between gross and net employment. Further, employment being a single variable, there is no arbitrary choice to be made between weighting schemes which can affect the final number. A question can be raised about whether to include unpaid labor in the measure of employment. There is a large literature, both international and Indian, on the subject, and inclusion of this component in periodic labor force surveys, survey estimates of employment reflects a well-established consensus. Questions can also be raised about the inclusion of different types of labor of widely varying productivity in a single measure of employment. I would emphatically argue against any differentiation on this count, since productivity is measured in value terms, bringing back in through the back door the same problem of weighting, which is one of the main infirmities of GDP estimates, as I have already mentioned. There are still other definitional issues about how employment is measured in the PLFS surveys. I will discuss some of these issues in the next part of this lecture. Meanwhile, proposing employment growth as the principal indicator of economic performance does not imply that we should ignore all other indicators. Employment taken together with GDP gives us a measure of productivity, and GDP along with population gives us a measure of per capita income. We thus have a comprehensive vector of 4 indicators to track the overall performance of the economy. However, I am arguing that among all these indicators, we should treat employment as the principal indicator. Let me now turn to what I call the paradox of growth in India. It is often mentioned that India is the world's fastest growing major economy and has been for some time. The latest World Economic Outlook indicates that in 2024, India's GDP grew at 6.5%, while China, the second fastest growing economy, was well behind at 5%. For 2025, the projections are 6.2% and 4% respectively. Of course, some of this might change following the Trump shocks. However, the growth of employment, which I have argued should be the principal indicator of our economic performance, has lagged behind. So, Table 1 actually has 3 parts, because as you know, in the PLFS and earlier the NSS employment-unemployment surveys, we have the 3 concepts. One is the usual status, the principal status, the principal and secondary status, and then the weekly status. So there are 3 different measures, and these tables 1.1, 1.2, this is usual principal status. This is usual principal and subsidiary status. and this is the current weekly status. So let me go back to the. So this is just giving you the GDP growth rate, and let me now read out the comparisons. So I'm reading right now. Accordingly, Table 1 compares real GDP growth for the period 2011-12 to 23-24 with employment growth rates for the same period in terms of UPS, UPSS, and CWS. While real GDP growth at 5.9% grew at 5.9% during this period, I showed you first. During this period, employment growth rate ranged from 4.8% to 5.6%. That is UPS and UPSS. Let me just read this because I keep moving back and forth. It just disturbs the flow of the talk. But I'll just show you the different parts of this table. That employment growth should lag behind GDP growth is not surprising, since a part of GDP growth is also attributable to growth of productivity. What is concerning, however, is that growth of employment has lagged behind the growth in labor supply. Now, before I go to the next, so this is the principal status. This is the principal plus subsidy status. And this is the current weekly status, alternative estimates of employment that I just referred to. So what is concerning, however, is that growth of employment has lagged behind the growth in labor supply. In PLFS concepts, growth of the workforce has lagged behind the growth of labor force. As a result, unemployment, or the gap between labor supply and labor demand, has also grown rapidly. The estimates ranging from 3.2% UPSS and 4.1% UPS to 4.9% CWS as compared to the GDP growth for the period 2011-12, 23-24. So that's all what we have been showing in the table so far. Thus, India is the fastest growing major economy in the world, but it also has a high rate of growth of unemployment. This is what I call the paradox of growth in India. We need to analyze this paradox and ask how it can be addressed. Now, in the written lecture, after this, I have gone into a digression of why our unemployment estimates are very fragile. One aspect which underestimates employment, and one which overestimates. So there are bias in two directions. We don't know what the actual picture is until some adjustments are done in the PLFS survey schedules as well as in the procedure. But I will not go into this digression here in the interest of saving time. But those of you who are interested, the lecture will be circulated after this and you can see it there. So let me go back to my main issue of why is unemployment rising rapidly despite the high growth of GDP? Or in other words, why is the demand for labor not keeping pace with the growth of labor supply? The simple answer is the very sharp and sustained increase in capital intensity, with rising productivity muting the demand for additional employment. Estimates based on RBI's CLENS database indicate that capital intensity rose from about rupees 29 to rupees 89 per 1,000 workers. This is all in constant 2011-12 prices between 2001 to 2023-24. In other words, in the 21st century. Then that is an increase of over 200%. But this raises the further question, why this sustained sharp increase in capital intensity? The standard neoclassical response based on relative factor prices would be that the cost of capital is too low for a capital scarce developing country like India, and that capital intensity has been rising in response to a rising wage-rental ratio. However, a comparison of the return on capital with the rise in real wages shows there is no clear evidence of a trend in the wage-rental ratio. So this is the capital intensity table that I just referred to, that 200% increase. And here is a comparison of the cost of capital by different measures. The table 3 indicates that the average interest on the stock of government debt in the period 2001 to 23-24, this is all the 21st century, was about 8%, while the average headline inflation rate was 5.9%, implying a real rate of interest of around 2.1%. The yield on government bonds of varying maturities, adjusted for inflation, ranges from 1.4% to 2.5%, that's in real terms. Corporate bond yields in real terms range from 1.9% to 2.4%. These rates are reflective of the financial depression in a state-dominated financial market where the public sector is the main borrower as well as the main lender of debt funds. In the capital market, which is much closer to the real market situation, the mean real return on equity, that is the Nifty 50 index, over the same period is much higher at 9.8%. That's the first column over there. As against this, the growth rate of real wages during the same period works out to 1.1% in case of regular workers and 3.8% in the case of casual wage workers. Those are the wage rates. But there is no trend increase in the wage rental ratio that can explain this rising capital intensity. In reality, technological change is not driven by relative factor price changes at the margin, but the competition among firms for their very survival, the perennial gale of creative destruction, as Schumpeter had called it. Indeed, rising capital intensity, the progressive replacement of labor by capital, has been the direction of technical change over centuries, as has been demonstrated by the recent work of Acemoglu and Robinson. The sustained and rapid increase in capital intensity in India, thus, is the norm. It is not an exception. Given that rising capital intensity is the normal long-term trend driven by market forces, what policy options are there to, if any, to accelerate employment growth within this broad secular trend? In order to address this question, let me first address the context set the context by discussing the structure of economic growth as was envisaged by the pioneers of modern economic development theory. In his seminal treatise on the rate structure and spread of modern economic growth, to which I've already referred earlier, one critical relationship Kuznets identified, among several others, is the changing structure of the economy with rising per capita income. He generalized that as per capita incomes rise, the structure of the economy shifts away from agriculture to the non-agricultural sector, which is very well known. He suggested, based on his then empirical observations, that the structural economy would first shift in favor of industry, especially manufacturing industry, and then services. Here, I am of course taking Kuznets as representative of a whole school of empirical economists of that time, who investigated and wrote about the same generalization of the structural change with rising incomes, and among them, I should mention particularly the pioneering work of Colin Clark and Hollis Chenery. Now, empirical generations in the Clark-Kuznets-Chenery tradition generally attributed the structural shift from agriculture to industry and then to services to differences in demand elasticities. As consumers move up the Engel curve with rising incomes, demand shares for the produce of agriculture, that is necessities like food, give way to industrial products and eventually services at an even higher level of income. Incidentally, Professor Radhakrishna's work, to which Professor Nachane referred earlier, also had a lot to do with this question of changing structure of demand with rising incomes. His early work on this was actually quite pioneering. Now, Kuznets apparently did not realize that his empirical generalizations also provided confirmation for the labor supply-driven theory of economic development which Arthur Lewis had already propounded in 1954, more than a decade before Kuznets published his magnum opus on modern economic growth. There is no reference to Arthur Lewis or his theory in that work. It is possible that by the mid-60s, Lewis's work had not yet received the attention it deserved, though both he and Kuznets went on to receive the Economics Prize, Nobel Prize for their work. Lewis's theory of economic development, with unlimited supply of labor and the diligent stylization of empirical evidence by Kuznets and others, became the foundation pillars of modern development theory. However, in his modern economic growth treatise, Kuznets had been careful to note that his generalizations were ad hoc and tentative. New evidence could make those generalizations invalid. Indeed, there were many concurrent and subsequent developments that extended or modified the Kuznets-Lewis framework. Theodor Schultz, Kuznets' companion at Yale and another Nobel laureate, published a treatise on the importance of transforming traditional agriculture for accelerating the pace of development. John Miller developed a model of agriculture-led growth. Then, drawing on the Asian experience, Shigeru Ishikawa argued the development required a net flow of resources into agriculture rather than out of agriculture. In my own PhD thesis on intersectoral resource flows in the Indian growth experience, I underlined the dual role of agriculture as a source of food and labor supplies, but also as a home market for the products of the non-agricultural sector. At that time, the focus of attention was all on the boundary between agriculture and the non-agricultural sector. Industry, especially manufacturing industry, was taken as a representative of the non-agricultural sector and other sectors outside agriculture. In a seminal contribution, building on the earlier work of Alan Young, Caldor developed a robust model of manufacturing-led growth. He argued that manufacturing industry has the special characteristic of increasing returns to scale. Economies of scale drive down costs, but correspondingly increase demand for inputs from other industries. This is through all the input-output linkages that Nachane was talking about earlier. As multiple industries reinforce one another in an expanding process of cumulative causation, this establishes a powerful engine of manufacturing-led growth. Caldor also argued that Keynesian demand management can greatly strengthen this process. Indeed, there is a widely held belief among economists that economic development, or industrialization as we sometimes call it, has to be led by manufacturing industry. But I rarely see any reference to the rigorous analytical foundation of this idea, which has been provided by Caldor. This may be attributable to the fact that Caldor belonged to the post-Keynesian school, which lost the battle of ideas in economics to the transatlantic neoclassical alliance. Be that as it may, the empirical foundation of this belief is somewhat fragile. Manufacturing industry indeed led the high growth phase of many countries in Europe after the Industrial Revolution. This is also true of East Asian countries in the high growth phase. But how much of the growth in Europe from the late 18th to the early 20th century is attributable to surplus transfers from colonies, and in late 20th century East Asia to their strategic and economic alliance with America, remains an open question. Of the 30 most advanced countries in the world today, that is in per capita GDP terms, excluding a few small island economies and so on, manufacturing accounts for 10% or less of GDP in a third of these, and 15% less in another one-third. In fact, recent literature in the Clark-Kuznets-Chenery tradition of empirical generalizations suggests that the share of agriculture GDP and employment declines with rising income. As the share declines, the structural economy shifts more in favor of services rather than industry. Rothon and Wells, in fact, suggested that beyond a point, the share of industry might stabilize, even decline, and they call this a process of deindustrialization. Now, focusing on the services sector, Arjun, Green, and Gupta analyzed cross-section data across developed and developing countries to show that there are two waves of services sector growth. A first wave as countries move from low to high middle income status, and a second wave as countries move from middle income to high income status. The first wave consists of mostly low productivity, labor intensive traditional services, while the second wave consists of high productivity modern services like finance, communications, and business. They also pointed out that in the post-1990 period, the initiation of the second wave is occurring earlier, overlapping with the first wave. It has to be added, all the references are given in the lecture when you get it. It has to be added in this context that in recent decades, there has been splintering of industries. This is splintering idea actually that Jagdish Bhagwati is the originator of that idea, meaning outsourcing of services, and they were earlier internal to a firm. That apart, many of the modern services can be exported and have features similar to industries such as high technology, specialization, scale economies, and linkages with other industry and services. Hence, the distinction between industry and services has become somewhat blurred. Clearly, the world moved well beyond the foundational stylized facts of development theory observed by Kuznets and other pioneers of that tradition half a century ago. Now, this widely held belief that growth has to be led by manufacturing industry also extends to India. The only two papers providing a recent evidence-based argument for this view are the paper of Viramani and Dheer and that of Nagesh Kumar. Both papers argue that in view of the strong backward and forward linkages of manufacturing industry, India's greater participation in global value chains can provide an opportunity for accelerating manufacturing-led growth. These views about the potential for manufacturing-led growth, of course, need to be squared with actual ground realities about the evolving structure of growth in India. That's my task table. In 1950-51, at the outset of newly independent India's economic development, agriculture was the predominant sector, accounting for 65% of GDP. By the turn of the century, that share had come down to 31%, and by 2021, it had come down further to 19%. During the same period, the share of industry doubled from 15% to 29%, but that of services went up by well over 150%, from 21% of the total to 53%. Services had already become the largest sector of the economy by the turn of the century, and it now accounts for well over half of Indian GDP. Now, these are all facts. Most are quite familiar with. The only question is what does it imply? Also, as Gaurava has pointed out, India is not an outlier in this. Its services-dominated structure of production is very much in line with the observed global pattern of economic structure at similar levels of per capita income. Where India is a major outlier, as Nair points out, is in the way the share of services in employment has lagged behind its share in GDP. The failure of services and also industry to draw labor out of agriculture is a specific Indian phenomenon. In this, we are outliers. So in table 5, I have presented a broad decadal pattern of structural change up to 2021. More recent years have been excluded because of volatility and disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, the most recent GDP numbers undergo frequent revision. However, the India Employment Report of the ILO and Institute of Human Development has given a more disaggregated picture of structural change in gross value added in the 21st century up to 2022, juxtaposing it against employment share of major subsectors of the economy. It reveals a broad inverse relationship between subsector shares, employment, and GDP. I do have confining the discussion to the larger subsectors, we know that agriculture is still the largest employer, accounting 45% of employment, but only 16% of GDP, implying a very low level of productivity. This is followed by construction, which accounts for 12% of the workforce and 8% of GDP. Next, the employment share of the group trade, hotels and restaurants at 12% is balanced, similar to the GDP share of 11%. The group transport, storage and communication also quite balanced in that its share of employment at 6% is the same as its 6% share of GDP. But on the opposite side, we have the group finance, business and real estate, which now accounts for as much as 23% of GDP, but only 3% of employment. Manufacturing, which accounts for now 19% of GDP, but only 12% of employment. And the group public administration, education and health, a very broad omnibus group, to the share of 13% in GDP, has a share of 90% in employment. Now, this inverse relationship, this is a very broad relationship. It is not because these observations are too few to talk about inverse relationship in a rigorous regression framework. This inverse relationship between sectoral share of employment and GDP points to a direct conflict between the goal of maximizing GDP growth and maximizing employment growth, which is why I started this lecture by asking the question, growth of what? While expressing my own preference for an employment-centered perspective of development, I have also nuanced that view by saying that growth of GDP and rising per capita income should also be included in the vector variables to be used for assessing economic performance. I believe that these conflicting policy goals can in fact be reconciled by an appropriate sequencing of priorities over time. For this, we need a more granular picture of employment, and that provided by the India Employment Report, which is on the board right now. Given agriculture's large share of employment and very low productivity, Bornali and Sahu have identified in a recent paper the most promising sectors of employment growth outside agriculture. There are a set of 7 sectors in industry and services which together account for 2/3 of total employment outside agriculture. And this, I believe, is indeed my last table. And in that, as you see, there are a set of 7 sectors in industry and services, which together account for 2/3 of total employment outside agriculture. Leaving aside the omnibus sector of other services, the remaining 6 sectors account for 64% of all non-agricultural employment. I would add to this list food processing and beverages, which Hunter and Sahu excluded for some technical reasons. There are large variations within the group, of course, but on average, for every additional ₹1 crore of output, these 7 sectors would on average generate 19 additional direct jobs and a total of 24 additional direct plus indirect jobs. And you can do the math on how this could impact these sectors, the overall employment scenario. Moreover, the skill requirement of jobs in all these sectors, except education research, would be very modest. This matches the low skill profile of the bulk of India's workforce. Employers organizations mention that more than half the entrants to the workforce are not employable in any skilled jobs. Less than 5% of our workforce have any certified skill compared to over 70% in most European countries and over 90% in some East Asian countries. This skill profile, unfortunately, cannot be changed overnight. It is helpful at this stage to recall the two waves of growth identified by Action Green and Gupta. Though their analysis was confined to services, the same identification can be extended to industry also, especially as the distinction between modern industry and services has become blurred. In the first wave, as countries move from low income to middle income status, non-agricultural growth is dominated by traditional industry and services. In the second wave, as in countries graduate from middle income to high income status, modern industry and services would dominate. India is now classified as a low middle income country, and all the large employment intensive sectors that I have identified, except education and research, are traditional industries and services as would be expected in the first wave. But they are no longer the fastest growing, as India begins to move towards high middle income status. Hence, providing incentives to these 6 sectors, which are high employers but with low productivity and low wages, to accelerate their growth would increase the employment intensity of GDP growth. This would help mitigate the crisis of rapidly increasing unemployment in the immediate future. It goes without saying that most of these jobs would be low productivity, low wage jobs. Perhaps this is the best that can be done in the short run, provide immediate employment and a means of livelihood for the burgeoning workforce, however modest that income or means of livelihood. However, these are not the well-paid good jobs that young entrants to the workforce aspire for. Nor is this the kind of workforce the country needs. India is on the cusp of a transition from a low middle income country status to high middle income status and eventually a high income country status. This is the aspiration reflected in the goal of Viksit Bharat by 2047. However, that transition cannot be accomplished with the present low-skill, low-productivity workforce. In the global economy of the 21st century, access to emerging new technology, especially artificial intelligence, and a suitably skilled workforce to deploy these technologies will determine which countries will remain competitive and progressive. It is therefore imperative that even while we maximize low-skill, low-productive employment in the short run, we prepare to switch to GDP growth maximization over the medium to long term, led by a highly skilled, high productivity workforce. This is that switch I was referring to earlier between employment maximization in the short run, but GDP growth maximization in the medium to long term. I believe the greatest failure of our development strategy from the outset has been the neglect of basic education. The Kothari Commission recommendations of focusing on basic education was turned on its head, and priority was given to higher education to produce engineers, scientists, and managers. It was perhaps a corollary of the second 5-year plan strategy of heavy industries-led growth, with the state in control of the commanding heights of the economy. This strategy, attributed to Mahalanobis, was inspired by the Feldman strategy of Soviet industrialization. But the Soviet Union never neglected basic education. Anyway, in the event, our basic, secondary, and higher education are all in a mess. Much has been written about what needs to be done for reforming basic education. Here, I will focus only on what needs to be done in secondary and higher education produce the high-skilled 21st century workforce that I have been referring to. Regarding the secondary stage, our skilling programs have not been effective in generating much skilled employment. We need a completely different approach and disruptive change, but change that can be managed within the framework of the new education policy. Based on the experience of successful vocational education in German technical academies and the University Technical College system in Britain, I have recently suggested that we introduce a similar UTC, standing for University Technical College, system of our own. In the four-stage framework of school education in the new education policy, a path to higher education through UTCs should be introduced as an alternative to conventional secondary schools at the fourth stage. The UTC curriculum should be STEM-oriented, including mandatory science and maths courses and language, along with alternative options and social science courses. This would be combined with, and this is critical, in-depth skilling in some technical field and teamwork based projects in that field with one or more actual corporate partners on their real-world technical problems. As a key feature of the UTC system, it would enhance the student's subsequent eligibility for apprenticeship and employment. The combination of a path to higher education, should a student choose that path with better eligibility for jobs and employment, give the UTC system an advantage over conventional secondary schools, which should help eliminate the prevailing negative perception of vocational education. But the UTC system to succeed also requires a strong relation between each UTC and the university and one or more corporates as co-partners. Introduction of UTCs will face challenges. Enrollment will be the first challenge, since conventional schools will want to retain their best students at the end of stage 3 for their own secondary classes. This is not a problem so long as students from the model group enroll in UTCs and not just the tail enders. For this, each UTC will need its own network of feeder schools. Finance will be another challenge, since by design UTC will be more resource and staff intensive than conventional schools. While governments will have to meet the initial capital cost and recurring cost for the first 3 years, perhaps extended for another 3 years at most, UTCs must really become self-financing. Cost-sharing partnerships among UTCs and exchange of experiences on cost-cutting best practices will help. However, in the main, UTCs should arrange student loan programs in partnership with banks, except, of course, for means-tested scholarship students. Initially, communicating the advantages of UTCs to have the buy-in of students and parents will be another challenge. Effective communication through multiple levels of government, academic experts, and media will therefore be critical. These communicators will also be important core partners of UTCs, along with the universities, feeder schools, corporates, and banks, to ensure the successful establishment of UTCs as a major plank for preparing India's high-skilled workforce of the future. The other plank is higher education to produce the scientists, engineers, and other professionals required to master the emerging new technologies, especially artificial intelligence, and manage their introduction in modern industries and services. Unfortunately, higher education has been in a crisis mode for a long time, and the problem is getting worse, as Deepak Nair has highlighted in the recent B.G. Deshmukh Memorial Lecture at the Indian International Center. One challenge is scale. Given the limited coverage of higher education institutions, massive expansion is required to relieve the intense competition students face to secure admission into decent institutions of higher education. The other main challenge is the quality of teaching and learning, which has been deteriorating for a long time and is now abysmal. Nair points out that a major part of the problem is the increasing centralization and loss of autonomy of institutions of higher learning. Politicians and bureaucrats have found that control of appointments and admissions to these institutions is an important source of their influence and power to peddle patronage. But it is doing enormous damage to our higher education system. Reform of the system to expand at scale and reverse the trend of deterring quality is urgent. However, that can only happen when our political leaders look beyond the next election and recognize how clientelism is compromising India's competitiveness and our path to future prosperity. I have so far discussed the urgency of making the structure of industry and services more employment intensive to maximize employment growth in the short term. I have also discussed the means of making workers in these sectors better skilled and highly productive in the medium to long term in order to ensure India's competitiveness in the emerging global economy and our future prosperity. However, whatever the developments and interventions in the non-agricultural sector, it is very clear that agriculture will remain a major employer in the economy for decades, despite its declining GDP share and very low productivity of the workforce in agriculture. Furthermore, a looming water crisis in agriculture is leading us towards an ecological disaster. Hence, how to make agriculture more productive in an ecologically sustainable manner is the key challenge in this sector. The Green Revolution made India self-sufficient in food grains, which was a great achievement. But in incentivizing farmers to produce more food grains, a whole range of policies were introduced, such as food grain procurement, a specified minimum support prices, and food subsidies in addition to subsidized supply of power, irrigation, fertilizer, and other inputs. It tilted the policy regime in favor of food grains. The same is also true by the way of sugarcane. This has left a very distorted cropping pattern to this day with consequent ecological implications. An urgent requirement is to raise productivity in agriculture. One part of doing this will require shifting the cropping pattern in favor of higher value-added crops such as fruits and vegetables. The other part will require diversifying away from crop production altogether towards more animal husbandry and aquaculture. To some extent, this is already happening with rising consumption of fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, eggs, and dairy products. This process can be accelerated through incentives to develop cold value chains, storage, and other infrastructure. On the ecological front, it must be underlined that agriculture accounts for, and this may shock you, accounts for 90% of water supply in this country. And of this, 80% is consumed by just three water-guzzling crops, namely wheat, rice, and sugarcane. India's gross cropped area has increased by 120 million hectares since the 1980s, mainly due to increase in groundwater irrigation, especially the tube wells, which account for about 84% of the increase in net irrigated area. At 250 billion cubic meters per year, India is the world's largest consumer of groundwater, consuming more than the combined consumption of the next two largest consumers, namely China and USA. This has resulted in a steep decline in water tables in large parts of the country. Shah and Vijay Shankar have made several suggestions to address the problem, such as incentives to diversify cropping patterns towards less water-intensive crops, especially the production of millets, use of water conservation practices, even for water-intensive crops like rice, and measures to conserve both blue water and green water. They have also pointed to the urgent need to regulate groundwater use. But most importantly, they have proposed that local people, producers, farmer organizations such as the famous Khera District Milk Producers Cooperative, and women's self-help groups be empowered to protect the soil and water. This has been a long talk. I have imposed on your patience. It is now time to draw conclusions. Everything that I have said points us towards three pillars of an employment-centered strategy of development. The first pillar is maximization of employment growth in the short run by incentivizing the growth of 6 or 7 large employment industry and services. These would be traditional low productivity sectors requiring relatively unskilled workers who would be hired at low wages. This matches the skill profile of a major segment of the Indian workforce, and this profile cannot be changed overnight, as I said. However, these would not be what we would call good jobs. But at least they will provide the large bulk of new entrant workforce with some means of livelihood, however modest. The second pillar is the introduction of UTCs as a secondary stage of education, combined with a complete overhaul of secondary education of higher education system to transform the Indian workforce into a high-skilled, high-productive workforce over the medium to long term. Producing a workforce capable of mastering the emerging new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, as I've mentioned, and managing their rollout or introduction to modern industries or services is essential. It is a prerequisite for ensuring that India remains globally competitive as it makes the transition from a low middle income country to a high middle income country and eventually a high income country or Viksit Bharat. The third pillar is in agriculture. Intervention will be required to significantly raise the level of productivity in an ecologically sustainable way. Cropping patterns will have to be nudged away from water-intensive crops towards high-value-added crops, while the overall production structure has to be shifted from crop to non-crop products such as dairy, poultry, fisheries, and other livestock. Now let me stop there. Thank you for your patience.
You see, I have also been studying this entire issue of unemployment and so on for quite some time now. And I have basically about 4 issues to talk about. Okay. But I'm not going to details at all. I will just sort of flag the issues. One is about this entire business of labor laws modification, to which I also referred to in my comments yesterday. Labor laws modification. And people led by Dr. Panadaria, they have been arguing, okay, that labor laws modification and removing some of the restrictions which have been placed, okay, would considerably facilitate the growth of employment. I think the intellectual basis for this is a famous article written by Wesley and Burgess, okay, in the BPW, so I don't remember the exact reference. Okay. Now, this point has become a bone of contention among labor economists in India. Okay. Lalit Deshpande, when he was in good health, when he was alive, and his student Shyam Sundar and so on. And there are many others who have taken up the cudgels, you see, against this sort of issue, okay, and have been arguing. So this is one thing that I would like to flag. The other thing is that I feel that we should also look at the other side of the coin, namely wages. Okay, what has been happening to the wages? I think, frankly, we have no idea. Okay, see, real wages, the calculation of real wages. What is the kind of deflator we use? See, we have argued, myself and Ali Richover, in a recent article, not very recent, but 2022 or so, in the International Labour Review, which is a journal published by the ILO, we have argued that a traditional CPI, okay, has what is called as a plutocratic bias. Okay? That is, it is essentially here to measure the inflation experienced by the upper classes, by the richer classes. And that the inflation experienced by the lower classes, okay, the poorer sections of the people, including workers, is higher. And we actually estimated it with the imperfect data that we had for about 3 or 4 years. Okay? And we found that the plutocratic bias you see, underestimates the inflation faced by workers by between 0.7 to about 1.2%, around that figure, okay? But this figure could be subjected to correction. But this plutocratic bias, I think, is something that we have to be more careful in calculating the real wage of workers. And the proper deflator to use and the proper index number to calculate the deflator is something which deserves a lot of attention, okay, from economic regimes. The third point that I would like to make is that we do not know, we have no idea whatsoever about the functional distribution of income. Okay? By the functional distribution of income, I mean, what is the share of wages as opposed to the share of profits in the national income, and what is happening to the share over the years. Now, this has not received any attention from Indian academics, with the sole exception of Miss Randive, Miss Kanta Randive, who wrote a book long ago called Income Distribution, the Unresolved Puzzle, or something like that. This book was very devastatingly reviewed in the Economic Journal, and Miss Randive, you see, sort of did not pursue the work further. Okay, but this tried to show what the labor share of national income was. Now, there are, to the best of my knowledge, the USA and Spain are two countries which are publishing these statistics. Okay, and US economists have shown that the share of wages has steeply declined, especially after the Reagan, the Reagan administration and the Reagan so-called anti-labor laws. Okay, and they found that the share of wages which were hovering around 45% or so of national income prior to the Reagan era is now at about 19 or 20%. So that's another thing on which we have to work. And the theoretical basis for this is to sort of use the Kaliski-Levy identity for national income rather than to use the Keynesian identity for national income. That y is equal to C plus I plus G. Instead of that, you use the Kaliski-Levy identity to calculate. The Bank of Spain has done work on this for Spain, and for the USA, the US Bureau of Labor Standards and so on has done work on this. So this is an issue on what the other. I like, sir, your point on the UTCs. I think that's important, and that also tallies with what a lot of people have been talking about: labor being unemployable, and skill upgradation, and so on. One thing on which I've been reading a lot recently is about AI, artificial intelligence. Okay. And how exactly is it going to affect the labor market? The general thinking seems to be, there are two schools of thought. One is what I would call the majority school of thought. The majority school of thought thinks that AI will displace the unskilled workers, okay? Possibly manufacturing workers, okay, will be the worst affected by. But then the minority group, which feels that AI will not be displacing the unskilled workers, but will be displacing the skilled workers, okay? And that group, I am more convinced by the arguments of this latter minority group, because the way AI is developing, the way you see, they are not really interested in developing more efficient systems for carrying loads and all that. They are, the researchers, the frontier people who are working on AI, are interested in developing newer techniques to analyze neurosurgery, okay? And improve managerial decisions. To have better ways of dealing with risk and various kinds of uncertainty and so on. So if that is happening, okay, the displacement that we are going to get is not among the unskilled workers, but among the skilled workers. But this is a point on which one can be arguable. So I'm very thankful to you, sir, for this very thought-provoking lecture. And I hope the audience will share my sort of enthusiastic response to your lecture. Thank you very much, sir. Upon Dr. Ali to give the vote of thanks.
Professor Nachane, Professor Sudipto Mundle, Professor Revathi, family members of Professor Radhakrishna Garu, members of Board of Governors, other distinguished guests, faculty, research scholars, and staff of CESS. On behalf of Center for Economic and Social Studies, it is my privilege to extend our heartfelt thanks at the conclusion of this eloquent memorial lecture held in honor of Professor R. Radhakrishna Garu. First and foremost, we express our deepest gratitude to our distinguished speaker, Professor Sudipto Mundle, for delivering such an informative and thought-provoking lecture. Sir, your insights have not only honored the memory of Professor Radhakrishna Garu, but also have inspired each one of us to carry forward his academic values and vision. Our sincere thanks to Professor Nachane for chairing the occasion and sharing his reflections on Professor Radhakrishna Garu and also on today's lecture. We also acknowledge with gratitude the presence of family members of Professor Radhakrishna Garu. Your support makes this tribute truly meaningful. A special word of thanks to our director, Professor Revathi, for making all efforts in organizing this thought-provoking lecture. Thanks are due to the support that came from the director PhD, finance and administrative staff, technical committee, electronic and print media, ensuring the smooth conduct of today's program. Thanks are also due to the supporting staff for creating this subtle ambience. Lastly, our heartfelt gratitude to each one of you in the audience for your presence, which reaffirms that the legacy of Professor Radhakrishna Garu continues to live on in our collective hearts and minds. As we conclude, let us carry forward the values and spirit that Sir has personified, making our work and lives evidence to his enduring heritage. Thank you.